I want to start with a hypothetical for you this morning. So it's Christmas time, and pretend that you've got a teenage nephew who is notoriously difficult to buy gifts for. It's not that he's ungrateful or anything like that, but more so it's that his parents are just extremely well off, and so there's not much of anything that this kid wants that he doesn't already have. In the past, you've mostly gotten around that by doing things like giving Amazon gift cards or cold hard cash. And that's been a good solution, but this year is a little bit different. Because just a couple weeks after Christmas, your nephew is gonna turn 18. And you'd like to do something extra special to kind of mark this passage into adulthood. And so for a few days, you rack your brain. You try to transport yourself back in time to when you were 18 to think about what would have made you happy, what would have brought you joy at that stage of life. And then one day, inspiration strikes. You recall that you and your nephew have always bonded over a mutual love for classic cars, and that he in particular loves classic Ford Mustangs. So you hop online, you do some searching, and you manage to find a 1966 Ford Mustang available for rent on the day of your nephew's birthday. It's a bit of a splurge for you, but you know it's gonna be worth it. It's gonna absolutely astound him. And so you book the rental, you print off the receipt, you wrap it in a tiny box, and you bring that box with you to your family Christmas gathering a couple weeks later. After some appetizers and conversation, it's time for the gift exchange. And when it comes to be your nephew's turn, you're interested to see that alongside your gift is another gift that's about the same size. Now, he doesn't know which one to start with, so he shrugs his shoulders and just so happens to grab the other gift, the gift that you didn't bring. He unwraps it, he pops open the lid, and proceeds to lose his ever-loving mind. Inside the box is a key. Your nephew springs out of his chair, runs across the house, out the front door with all of the family in tow, out into the driveway where he sees waiting for him a shiny, black 1965 Ford Mustang with a big bow on top. And in that moment, you die just a little bit inside. Your gift was thoughtful. Your gift was valuable. Your gift was good, but there's no denying it. The other gift, it was better. Well, today I want to share a few stories with you from the Bible that illustrate a similar concept. These stories come to us from the life of Moses. And while we don't normally associate Moses with the Christmas season, let me just go ahead and say up front, this is very much a Christmas message. It's a story about how God gives us good gifts and how in Jesus, he gives us the perfect one. So the beginning of Moses' story is found in the book of Exodus, chapter 1. But before we dive in there, I probably ought to establish a bit of background information about Moses. So in the book of Exodus, we find ourselves in the early days of Israel. A few generations, though, before Moses came on the scene, his ancestor Abraham had been chosen by God to be kind of his representative to the people. God had given Abraham and his family the land of Canaan, and he had promised them that someday in the future, the Messiah, the very Savior of the world, would come through Abraham's family tree. It's an unbelievable promise. It's God's assurance to Abraham that big, beautiful things are on the way for the people of God. But in Exodus chapter 1, we find the descendants of Abraham seemingly still a long way off from that idyllic future that God had promised them. Over the course of a few decades, things have taken a turn for the worse for Abraham's family. Famine has fallen upon the promised land, and now they've taken refuge in neighboring Egypt, where Abraham's great-grandson Joseph has used his influence to secure for them food and shelter. And so to summarize, Abraham's descendants, I'm gonna call them the Israelites from this point forward, find themselves sort of stuck in limbo. They've experienced famine and they've escaped it, and that's clearly a good thing, but they're also still a long way off from this beautiful future that God's promised them. They're in a place where things are good, but not great. And if that sounds familiar to any of you, maybe it should, because I think that's exactly where many of us find ourselves at Christmas time. We're surrounded by lights and carols and celebration, and yet deep down, I think we all feel like something's missing. It's like we're living in the good, but longing for the better. And so with that for context, let's hop into our first passage for today. We're in Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 through 14. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. And there's more here, but I'm going to actually stop right off the bat because, folks, this is very much not a good thing. I didn't dive super deep into the connection between Abraham's great-grandson Joseph and Egypt, but I probably ought to address that a little bit more here because Joseph's connections in Egypt, they went all the way to the top. Joseph was one of the most trusted advisors to the previous Pharaoh, and he had received special privileges because of that relationship. And so when we read in this chapter about a new Pharaoh coming to power who didn't particularly care about Joseph or his people, alarm bells should go off in our heads. We should start to get very worried about what's in store for the Israelites. Let's continue reading. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So yeah, new Pharaoh, he has a major case of paranoia. Probably some xenophobia too. The Israelites are multiplying, and he doesn't trust them. So what do you do with people you don't trust? Well, apparently, if you're the Pharaoh in Egypt, you oppress them. So continuing in verse 11. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. It's grim stuff. And I suspect it might be about this point that some of you are thinking to yourself, Dayne, this is the week of Christmas. I see sweaters in the audience. It's the happiest season of all, and you're hitting us with systemic oppression? What gives? Well, let me remind you of what I said earlier. There is a beautiful Christmas message buried somewhere in here, but we're going to have to dig a little bit longer before we find it. So pull out those snow shovels. And actually, if you thought that was bad, things are about to get even worse in verse 15. We'll pick up there. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. So we've upped the ante from slavery to a full-on ethnic cleansing. Again, Pharaoh is paranoid. He's concerned that these foreigners are going to take over his country, and so when working them to the bone doesn't do much of anything to thin their numbers, he turns to straight-up murder. Reading on, the midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Skipping ahead to verse 22, then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. All right, time for some recapping. God has promised the people of ancient Israel a bright future with a homeland and lots of offspring and eventually a Messiah who's going to come through their family. And these promises are meaningful, and I have to imagine they're a source of tremendous hope for the people of Israel. But they seem, at this point in time, like not much is going according to plan. The Israelites have the large family bit coming together, but apart from that, they've had to flee to a different country to escape famine. And then within a few generations, the mood in that country in Egypt has turned against them. They found themselves oppressed, enslaved, and under threat. And now with this new king, he's issued a murderous decree to kill literally every baby boy born to them. Darkness is all around them. And I have to imagine that in this moment in history, the light of God felt faint and far away. His promises likely felt flimsy or maybe even false. But it's in the midst of this darkness that God's plan starts to take shape. A plan that would culminate after many twists and turns some 1,500 years later in a little town called Bethlehem. So let's read about the beginning of this plan in Exodus chapter 2. Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister, that's the baby's sister, stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. And this is where the baby's sister comes in, so watch how clever she is. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. And when the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." It's a pretty crazy story, isn't it? I mean, you've got to love the ways in which God is at work here. Moses' mother obviously doesn't want to drown her son, but, and I wonder if you noticed this the first time through, she doesn't want to break the law either. So what does she do? Well, she follows the law by throwing her baby into the Nile. He just so happens to be floating in a basket when she does this. And she just so happens to put him in the river at the exact moment when Pharaoh's daughter is taking a bath. Then Moses' sister just so happens to overhear that Pharaoh's daughter wants to save the child and recommends her own mother, who is also Moses' mother, as someone who could nurse him. My favorite bit, Pharaoh's daughter says to the mother, quote, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So not only does Moses' mom have her baby back, but now she's getting paid to raise him. Kids in the room, this is like grandma getting you the toy you want for Christmas and remembering to include the batteries. Bonus. This is the origin story of Moses, and quite frankly, it's bonkers. But it's also really, really cool to see the creativity of God at work. And this is only the beginning of Moses' story. Moses would go on to become one of the most significant people in all of the Old Testament. As I mentioned earlier, Moses was born into a moment of profound darkness for the people of God. God's promises still flickered like a distant flame, but they seemed awfully far off and in danger of being extinguished. But then Moses comes on the scene. And Moses is the switch that reignites the flame of Israel. As a young man, Moses would stand up to Pharaoh. He would speak on behalf of God, and ultimately, he would lead his people out of captivity in Egypt. From there, Moses was the person responsible for delivering the 10 Commandments to Israel, for commissioning the first dwelling place for the Lord, for establishing the priestly order of God and the system of rituals and sacrifices that allowed people to get right with God. Moses would then lead the people on a journey through the wilderness and eventually all the way to the doorstep of the promised land. For all these reasons and more, Moses is an important figure. He's a beloved figure. But today, on the doorstep of Christmas, I want to show you an aspect of Moses that maybe you haven't considered before. Because for all Moses was, all that he accomplished in the name of God, perhaps his greatest gift to us is actually when we view him as something of a litmus test, as a point of comparison to one who would come much later and accomplish far more. So here I'm referring to Jesus, but what do I mean when I say I want to use Moses as a litmus test or as a point of comparison to Jesus? Why would I want to draw parallels or contrast between these two men who lived more than 1,000 years apart and in very different circumstances? Well, because, as creator of the Bible Project Tim Mackey puts it, ultimately, the Bible is a unified story that points to Jesus. I believe that's true, and I believe this truth becomes more evident the more time we spend with the Bible. Yes, the Bible is a collection of literature written in different styles and voices and composed over the course of hundreds of years. But the common denominator between all of that is that the Bible is all about Jesus. And by all about Jesus, I mean all about Jesus. Although people in the Old Testament wouldn't have noticed it, there are many, many parallels between their lives and the story of Jesus. Many of us think of the story of Jesus as confined to the first couple chapters of Luke and the first chapter of Matthew, but it's so much bigger than that. And so today what I want to do is I want to demonstrate this idea of the connection between the life of Moses and the life of Jesus by telling you a few stories, looking again at the life of Moses and then making some comparisons. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take you through and summarize a few of the aspects of Moses' life, and then I'm going to show you how those things align with the life of Jesus. As we go along, I want you to keep in mind the story I started off my message with this morning, the one about the Christmas gift that was good, but not great. Because here's my theory. I think that when we read about Moses, we're supposed to see something that's good, but not quite perfect. And I think this reality is supposed to become even more clear when we compare the life of Moses against the much greater life of Jesus. So let's start with the first Bible story I told you today, the story of how the Israelites came to Egypt in the first place. So as you might recall, Abraham's family, the ancestors of Moses, fled to Egypt to escape famine in their own land. Fast forward 1,500 years, and we read this in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2. An angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph, that's Jesus' earthly father, in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you." This, my friends, is a parallel, and it's not accidental. Moses' ancestors fled their land and went to Egypt to escape famine. Jesus' family, meanwhile, was also instructed to flee to Egypt. Why? Well, this leads us to parallel number 2. An angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So do you see that? The reason Mary and Joseph were instructed to flee to Egypt is because someone was seeking to kill the baby Jesus, which sounds vaguely familiar. I seem to recall someone else earlier in this message who was seeking to kill an infant as well. And if you dig deeper into the gospel, you're going to find more similarities still. Earlier in Matthew chapter 2, we get the full story on Jesus' side of things. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. So why was King Herod disturbed? Well, because he saw Jesus, the so-called King of the Jews, as a threat to his rule, which again sounds a lot like Pharaoh's paranoia about the Israelites in the days of Moses. And just like with Pharaoh, Herod then launches an evil plot to eliminate the threat. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." But as many of you might know, Herod had absolutely no intention of worshiping Jesus. As the story unfolds, the Magi depart for Bethlehem, where after presenting their gifts to Jesus, they receive a warning from God not to return to Herod. And in chapter 2, verse 16, we find out why. When Herod realized that he'd been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Again, this should sound familiar to the conditions Moses was born into. Jesus' family fled to Egypt to escape a murderous decree from Rome. Meanwhile, Moses' family was seeking a way to avoid an equally murderous decree from the Pharaoh of Egypt. This sort of parallelism is not a coincidence, and it's far from a one-off. When we see narrative circles like this one in the Bible, they ought to arrest our attention. They ought to make us sit up and pay attention because they reveal that God is very much up to something that is quite possibly going to blow our minds. Now, that might seem like a bit of an overstatement. The fact that Moses and Jesus were both displaced to Egypt and that both were trying to get away from a murderous ruler it's interesting, I suppose, but maybe that doesn't for you rise quite to the level of mind-blowing. And that's fair enough. But as the lives of Moses and Jesus continue, the similarities continue too. And maybe more importantly, some significant dissimilarities start to crop up as well. And I think it's these dissimilarities that elevate this comparison from interesting to mind-blowing. So what do I mean by that? Well, to illustrate, let's try this. Do you remember what the name Moses means? We talked about it just a minute ago. I'll remind you with the verse again. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." So when we read this in isolation, this revelation about Moses' name maybe seems sort of trivial. But then we get this from Matthew chapter 3. As soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. At that moment, heaven was opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." When Moses came out of the water, he was given a name as a reminder of the physical salvation he had received. But when Jesus came out of the water, he was named the Son of God, the one who would bring eternal salvation to everybody who puts their trust in him. Moses rising out of the water was a good thing, but it pales in comparison to Jesus' rise from the water. Kind of like the Christmas gift analogy I told you earlier, when we read stories concerning Moses, I think we ought to think kind of like we do about that lesser Christmas gift. That's interesting, or maybe even that's good. But when we read stories concerning Jesus, we should think, oh, that's better. And maybe even that's perfect. Let's look at a few more examples of this idea in action. In Exodus 20, Moses ascends a mountain to receive the 10 commandments God has given to guide the people of Israel. And that's a good thing. People need instructions from God about how they should live. But then in Matthew 7, Jesus, speaking not coincidentally from a mountain of his own, identifies the ways in which the commandments have been distorted and goes to great lengths to clarify the heart behind the 10. That's better. In Exodus, we find Moses and the Israelites wandering in the desert for 40 years, where slowly but surely they learn to rely on God for their provision. That's good. But in Matthew 4, Jesus himself has retreated into the desert, where for 40 days he is tempted by Satan before he ultimately prevails and demonstrates his divinity. That's better. In Exodus 35 through 40, Moses and his people build the first temple of God in the form of an elaborate tent, where the Spirit of God dwells. And in the book of Numbers, Moses establishes the tribe of Levi as the priestly class tasked with administering God's rituals and sacrifices. These are good things. But then in John 2, Jesus declares himself to be the temple of God. And he foreshadows his own resurrection by saying, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." That's better. Further, in 1 Corinthians 3, Paul explains that as followers of Jesus, we have become the living temples of God, and that his Spirit literally dwells within each and every one of us. And that's better too. In Deuteronomy 3, Moses brings the Israelites to a physical promised land from which God has commanded them to be a blessing to others. It's good. But in Matthew 28, Jesus declares the whole earth to be our promised land and gives us the great commission of spreading his gospel everywhere in the world. And that's better. And then comes the great crescendo. In Leviticus 9, Moses establishes a system of rituals and sacrifices designed to allow people to get temporarily right with God. Very good thing. But in Matthew 27, and Luke 23, and John 19, Jesus surrenders to death on a cross and becomes the ultimate sacrifice that renders all future sacrifices unnecessary. Jesus dies in our place, and because of this, we are reconciled to God forever, and we have a place in his kingdom. That's a whole lot better. In fact, you might argue it's perfect. So do you see it? Do you see what God's up to when he presents Moses and the Israelites as these points of comparison to Jesus? Temples and commandments and priests and sacrifices, these are all good things. But Jesus, the same Jesus we celebrate the birth of this Christmas season, he's far, far better. So I've got 2 takeaways for you this morning. We'll call them my Christmas gifts to all of you. First, I want to offer you a pair of Jesus glasses. They're not real, just put them on hypothetically. Glasses that I hope you will wear every time that you read the Bible from now on. Because although the heart of the Christmas narrative takes place in the books of Matthew and Luke, the story actually begins much, much earlier than that. In fact, I firmly believe it's woven all throughout the Bible. Look for Jesus when you read the Bible, and I think you'll be surprised at how often you find him. And you might even have your mind blown every now and again. So that's gift 1. Gift 2, and maybe the more important gift for this season, is the gift of perspective. Although darkness and difficulty persist in our world, the truth is that we live in a world completely transformed from the one that Moses found himself in all those years ago. Moses' hope was in a future that was distant and that was uncertain. But our hope, it's certain and it's present. This Christmas, I hope you'll take heart in the fact that Jesus has come and that we live here and now in the better that he made possible.